Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming to yet another interview for our business virtual summit. Today we're talking with Marc Kramer, and he has a podcast called Best Business Minds. And we're going to talk to him about how he put this podcast together, how he's been using it, how it's been successful for him, and what it takes to put on a podcast. Because we all hear that podcast, but I don't think a lot of people really understand how much work really is involved. So Marc, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, first thing I want to kind of ask is really, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about the podcast, what made you start it, and how it's been working for you?
Sure. So I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've run over 25 startups, four turnarounds. I'm working on a new venture now in the metaverse. When I'm in between ventures, I do consulting for entrepreneurs, family businesses. I'm the executive director of the Private Investors Forum. So I run 7 events a year to bring entrepreneurs and investors together, and two major events during the course of the year to help entrepreneurs raise capital. During the very beginning of COVID in March of 2019, remember everybody was kind of stuck at home, really nothing more to do than watch Netflix, and everybody was at a standstill. So I thought, what if I started a podcast? Didn't know anything about podcasts, never listened to a podcast before. But what if I started a podcast using Zoom and I interviewed business book authors and I call it the Best Business Minds? So I bought this name. I contacted Dr. Laura Hung, who I taught 10 years at Wharton. She was a colleague at Wharton. Now she's at Harvard. And she wrote a book about the book is called Edge, and it's how to overcome adversity. So I called her up on a Thursday and said, Laura, I want to do a podcast. Could you be my first interview? And she said, sure. When do you want to do it? I said, tomorrow. And she goes, is that enough time to even get an audience? I said, I'll send out an email. Maybe we'll get 20, 25 people that will come on. Oh, okay. Sounds good. So we did a live Zoom cast. Unbeknownst to me, podcasts are not typically done live. Almost none are done live. So we did this live Zoom cast, and 172 people came on to listen to it. And after it, everybody said, oh, when are you doing the next one? I hadn't thought about a next one yet. So I went and contacted other friends who'd written books. I've written 6 books. And I got another friend to come on the following Tuesday. For the first 6 months, I was doing every Tuesday and Friday live Zoom cast, interviewing business book authors, which required me to find the books, connect with the authors, read the books, so that way I could carry on an intelligent conversation. And my podcast is an hour long. And so in the beginning, I thought, why wouldn't, if people are listening to, I'm sure they've got questions for the author. So I would send out a note at the beginning and say, any questions you have, put it in chat. Well, people would write their questions instead of saying to how most people would do it, which is, okay, we have two, after going through all the questions, the interviewer usually does, and the interviewer might say, okay, we have time for 2 questions. Well, I said to all the listeners, when you ask the question, type in the chat, I will ask it immediately. So if I have 30 questions to ask and I only get through 3, and the next 20 questions come from the audience, I'll just ask those questions. So the audience felt engaged. That was really important, to make sure the audience felt engaged. And after about 8 interviews, one of the best-selling authors came on and he said, hey, I heard about this. It sounds great. I want to do it. And he did it. And he goes, this is fantastic. I said, what did you like about it? He says, it's live. I said, so there are no live podcasts. You're the only one I've ever been on that did it live. So I go, great. Well, then all of a sudden, people really liked it. And now I'm booked for a year in advance. I had just a guy come on last Friday. He said, do you realize that you booked me 1 year and 2 months ago? That's how long it took. So I'm booked all the way until June of next year.
That's awesome.
Yeah, every Friday live on Zoom. And so I interview these authors. So what's been great about it has been the contacts I've made. I've made amazing contacts. I've had people who are major CEOs of companies like Cisco, major venture capitalists. I have people who've been on who are on the boards of Verizon and Nordstrom's and other public companies. I've had famous professors who've written best-selling books. So the contacts and what I've learned have been worth every minute. Now, mind you, it takes me about almost a day and a half of time a week. And my day is like 12, 14 hours. So my day isn't 8 hours when I'm measuring.
Hmm.
So for me to go and do the email marketing for it, and that's about 14 different places I post uh, that I am having this show. And then I send it out twice in a broad blast email using something called Ticket Leap and another blast email on Constant Contact. And then I also posted on LinkedIn a couple of times. And I typically have an audience of about 110 people sign up and 50 to 60 actually come on live.
Yeah.
And the rest of them essentially wait for me to send them the link to the video and watch it at their own time. And the authors I interview are from literally around the world. I interview them from China, Europe, the Middle East. They've literally been all over the planet.
Awesome. Great. So there's a lot to unpack there, but some of the things that definitely stood out to me is the way you're engaging your audience is different, and how you're bringing them to be included is different. Doing it that live Zoom cast, the contacts you've been able to develop, and how you've been able to leverage this, podcast into business, which is why anybody should really be doing anything when they're a business owner. Obviously, it's adding to your credibility, and then the time commitment, which is that marketing and stuff. So, what I kind of want to get into first is talk about the audience and how you're engaging them. You had mentioned that you have the question set up and that you're doing it live. Is there any other way that you're trying to engage your audience or create that, for lack of a better word, camaraderie of being a part of it?
So actually, it's just the fact that they can ask the questions on chat. When I first did it, the first episode or two, I
Mm-hmm.
let people come on live and ask their question. Well, that became chaos. So that was just crazy. I thought, oh, well, that would really bring it alive for them. But that just did not work out. And I stopped
Yeah.
that immediately and just had people type in their questions on chat. But they liked it knowing that I was going to ask those questions right away.
Mm-hmm.
So that went over big. And look, if the audience isn't engaged, then it's really hard to attract audience and get people to recommend you. And I've met a lot of famous people in the audience. Like I had a famous defense attorney that would listen every single week, and now he still listens. But now because the pandemic is essentially over, people are back to work. The live audience isn't as big as it was before because people are busy. But
Yeah.
I do mind during Eastern time lunch, 12 to 1, because it allows me to hit the West Coast people and the Europeans all at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
People, I have listeners in Russia and China and in Asia, and typically they listen to it later.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So definitely keeping in mind where your audience is located and their time zone is obviously a really good thing to think about when you're creating a podcast. But as far as the audience goes, how did you start figuring out like who was listening and where to find them?
Well, essentially, they engage themselves. So my listeners, because we track everything. We
Mm-hmm.
track where they've come from, how they found out about us, titles, everything. So 93% of our audience is C-suite, and 67% of them are CEOs of companies.
Okay.
And so it turns out that studies show that all, CEOs are typically readers, and especially of business books.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked a specific niche. I have two other podcasts, one called Stress Free Family Business, where I interview family leaders of family businesses. And I have one for the Angel Venture Fair, where I interview entrepreneurs and VCs. But those require even more work because there's so many people, well, not the family business, but the entrepreneurs there's a bazillion people interviewing entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
And there's all kinds of people out there saying, hey, I can help you get audience, or I can help you get more people to interview. And that's never been a problem of mine, is
Hmm.
getting people to interview. Of course, audience is always a problem. And so I go and sign up for different LinkedIn groups, although that's not very useful. A lot of
Hmm.
people don't look at the LinkedIn groups, but I use my alumni association. I'm a graduate of West Virginia University and Penn State. So I post on the alumni, and that's really been good. And I post on other sites related to CEOs of companies. And I just do short things. I also put it on Facebook, in Facebook groups that I belong to. So
Hmm.
essentially, that's how I get my audience.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So moving on to the next piece that I think we should talk about is, so we talked a little bit about how you're leveraging this and the contacts that you're making. One way is simply just from people engaging into what you're talking about and your speakers. But what are some other ways that this has brought people back to you that could be leads or contacts? Just besides the obvious one of like the speakers become a contact and potential people to interact with you.
Well, the audience hears in the beginning, I tell them who I am and what I do. And
Mhm.
I've had audience contact me and said, oh, I didn't know that you did this. I would love to talk to you about helping us with the marketing plan or helping us with financial modeling, whatever that may be. They'll contact me and say, oh, we could use this help. Let's talk about it. And so I've gotten some clients from that as well.
Okay. Um, and then, so I'm trying to phrase this correctly. So like, um, when you're thinking in terms of the, like, I know what I want to say in my head. I'm just trying to make it makes more sense. So like the pipeline, when you're thinking, you have your initial reach out where it's like completely cold and then it gets warmer and you have like your step ladder, for lack of a better picture. Um, this podcast, where is it in that piece for you? And is it its own piece where it has its
It
own leads, or is it like part of like a value add for you?
Now, well, I just did it because I wanted to engage with my clients and give them something that's useful.
Hmm.
I didn't realize it would grow to the point that I'm in 62 countries and won 2 awards. That wasn't in the planning. I had no
Yeah.
idea that that would be the case. And I do it now because I like reading business books.
Hmm.
And so I'm thinking, while I'm reading the books, it'd be great to interview the authors and ask them questions. And of course, I realized, man, this is a lot of work because I have to be very understanding of the books and ask them insightful questions.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to that. So it's kind of um, its own entity,
Hmm.
and it helps open up doors for me with other types of folks that, venture capitalists, bankers, anybody who's written a business book, and then the contacts they have. So it's really exponentially grown my contact base. I
Yeah.
mean, I've added on LinkedIn alone almost 3,000 new contacts.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, cool. So a huge leverage tool for you, and especially so if anyone's putting a podcast together or any kind of thing that can help you do your credibility or grow your reputation, it's definitely a huge leverage tool to use those contacts.
It
It's a
really can't be self-serving.
Yeah.
So if it's self-serving, then not very useful to people, if it's all about you.
Yeah.
But if you giving them information that will help them grow their business, drive more sales, um, attract new employees, if it could help them reduce cost, if it can help stimulate new ideas, great. And you got to get quality people. I mean, every week I'm contacted by people who tell me that oh, I love your show. The show is great. I'd like to get my boss on or my client on. And then you find out they don't have a book.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, how much could you have actually have watched it if you are suggesting these people?
Exactly. Especially not to know that the theme of it is book writers.
Yeah.
Very good. And then so that kind of leads into the next piece. So the commitment that you have of how long it takes to put everything together, to market it, and to you know get everything set for it. I think that some of the things I want to break down about that is, um, for lack of a better purpose, like a day in the life of what happens when you're getting yourself ready. We talked a little bit about some of the marketing you do. What are some other things that you have to get done for this podcast to get heard and get out there and get together?
Well, I asked the authors to send it out to their constituents,
Hmm.
to their ecosystem. I asked the audience if they'll also send the link out to their ecosystem. So I'm leveraging everybody's groups
Yeah.
to go and do that. And but the biggest amount of work for me is actually reading the book and developing the questions.
Okay.
And look, if I wasn't doing books and I was interviewing CEOs of companies, I would have to do research on the company, research on the industry. To do a good podcast requires a lot of work, a lot of preparation.
Hmm.
It's knowing a fair amount about the person you're interviewing and what the audience would like to hear.
Absolutely. And okay. And then when it comes to some of the more tangible things, like the process of the equipment, the sound, I know there's
I
a
have
lot
to
of stuff
tell
out
you,
there. So
I don't use a ring light, and maybe I should. I usually am in a bright lit place. I have a microphone that I typically use. I'm not using it now, I'm just using my computer, but typically I have a microphone that I attach,
hmm.
and that's it. I don't really do anything else.
Hmm.
I'm using Zoom. Zoom's good already.
Yeah.
So, and for people, I think they're fine with it. They're not expecting it to look like ABC Nightly News
Yeah.
with super graphics and everything, and they're more or less interested in the content itself.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Information is key, and that's why it's so important, like you said, to do your research, know what you're going to talk about, and especially when you're hitting those level of people that you're talking about. So knowing your audience is that key, because if you're talking one way to certain people and another way, and you're trying to hit some other people, you have to know who you're trying to hit, and that is something with any kind of product that you're trying to put out there, whether it's a podcast, a TV show, web show, whatever. um, okay, so then had one other question that just went out of my brain. So while I try to remember what that question was, any thoughts on things that we haven't covered yet when it comes to podcasts or creating things in that
Well, I
realm?
think it's good to get a good editor who can do the sound editing
Hmm.
and edit it. So I use an outside editor. I pay $350 a month for this editor. So you can imagine already I've spent about $7,000 in just editor cost
Hmm.
to do it. I have hosting is not that much, but I'm hosted on SoundCloud and I put it up on Spotify and a whole bunch of different places. But SoundCloud costs me less than $200 a year. I use Dropbox to put things in, so that's a couple $100 a year. The
Hmm.
microphone's about $99 to go and buy. The logo was another couple $100. The website, another couple $100. So all in, after 2 years, I've probably spent 10,000.
Hmm.
And I guess that's good for them to know, to figure out what is this really going to cost.
Absolutely, and that way they can
And don't
figure out
forget
the.
your time. So if I'm trying to bill at like 250 bucks an hour, $300 an hour.
Hmm.
If I'm telling you I'm spending 12 hours, that's $3,600 a week that I'm spending of my time that I could do something else, times 52 weeks of the year. I'm spending a couple $100,000 a year it's cost me, I guess, 500,000 of just my time.
Hmm. Yeah,
Now, I consider it worthwhile to go and do, but most people don't factor in their time. But time is, if you're doing consulting work, time is money because otherwise you don't get paid for that.
absolutely.
My
And I,
daughter told me the best part of this whole podcast was that I interviewed the president of the Sixers, and he liked being on my show so much that he gave us a box that he catered for a playoff game.
cool.
So my daughter was like, okay, now this podcast is worth something.
Yeah.
And
And that
I've had billionaires on, so the contacts there have been good.
absolutely, I
Yeah.
would imagine.
And
Uh,
friends all over the world.
mhm, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point to make, especially for people who are either just starting out in their business or are more of in the actively working in their business instead of working on their business, and changing that mindset where you start thinking of things in the terms of um, I need to value what I'm doing when it comes to my company. And that should be something someone thinks about when they're thinking about putting a podcast together or something to this measure, because it can become a very good lead source as it has for you. But if you're not thinking of the things that we're talking about, where like, who are you going to hit? Where are they? And how are you going to market this and build this? And then how does that turn into a client for you? You're just going to be spinning your wheels for a long time. And like you said, you could be wasting that money. So, in business, we always want to be thinking that way. Um, all right. So we talked about, to kind of summation, we talked about our audience and how we want to hit them. We talked about some of the ways that you were being different by, being live and having people do their contact questions in time. Also how we've been,
And you have to be well prepared.
mhm,
As I mentioned, well prepared and authentic.
yeah. And that, genuine and stuff. And that's something that's definitely a good point as well, because if you're going to go into the white noise of podcasts, you have to stand out somehow. And you have to, a lot of people listening to podcasts are doing it for that information or for that knowledge or for that that lesson that they can have. So if you're kind of boring people, or more of like not presenting it in a way that's understandable, you definitely start falling back into that white noise. And then we talked about obviously the credibility that it brings you, and then some of the time that it takes to get into it. Before we kind of get into some actionable steps for people who are looking to potentially do this, anything else that you think they should know about podcasts, how to use it or how to create it?
I just think that you need to leverage your own area of expertise and interest. And if you do that, no matter what that is, I think that you can develop a good podcast. I think if you're looking to go and do something just to do it, it's hard to do because it requires a lot of work and consistency and stick to itiveness. And if you're really not interested in the subject,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to stick with it.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. So when it comes to actionable steps for the people watching, what are some good first thing that they should do when they're considering creating a podcast?
As I mentioned, the thing they should do if they're creating a podcast is think about your area of expertise, who your target market is, what do you want to get out of it? Those are the things, and how much time you're willing to put in it. What's the frequency? Mine's once a week. I don't think you want to go more than once a week. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And the audience has so many options that you probably can't get more than that much mind share, unless you're Joe Rogan or somebody like that, who has this national following, like a talk show, that they could go and do it. But for most of us, I don't think that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to remember, how much time do you actually have to devote to this?
Yeah.
And so you have to think about those things.
Awesome. All right. So once again, Marc Kramer from Best Business Minds podcast. We've been learning about all the different things it takes to make a podcast, and we just went through some actionable steps. So Thanks so much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you guys at the networking event later today.